Hello, this is Joe Trahan, welcoming you to the All Me podcast from the Taylor Hooten Foundation, whose mission is to enlighten the world to the truths about appearance and performance-enhancing substances. As the national leader on this subject, they communicate their educational messages through various methods, including this podcast. Thank you for listening and enjoy the show.
Welcome back to the All Me podcast. This is Don Hooten Jr., president of the Taylor Hooten Foundation, and today I'll be your host. In this episode, I'm going to be talking with Dr. Margaret Goodman, who is a neurologist that has an extensive career in combat sports. She has been a ringside physician for over 500 professional fight cards, and she's going to provide us with an inside look into the world of boxing and mixed martial arts. Dr. Goodman has given interviews to newspapers, magazines, and websites on medical issues as it relates to boxing and MMA, including Sports Illustrated, the New York Times, USA Today, Maxim, and many more. You will hear the passion that Dr. Goodman has for the safety and well-being of all athletes. It's quite inspiring. Being one of the first female ringside physicians in a male-dominated sport, Dr. Goodman shined. She's received numerous awards for her accomplishments, and when you hear her stories, you'll quickly understand why she is so decorated in her profession. We're going to talk about the use of appearance and performance-enhancing substances, and you'll hear the two of us share our passion for anti-doping to keep athletes safe and healthy. Dr. Goodman is the founder and president of the Voluntary Anti-Doping Association, who currently provides drug testing services to boxers and MMA fighters. This episode is full of great stories and valuable information. We're very thankful for the time that Dr. Goodman spent with us to share her wealth of knowledge and expertise so that we can be more educated about this topic. Please be sure to take a screenshot of this episode, post it on Twitter, and tag the Taylor Hooten Foundation and the Voluntary Anti-Doping Association and let us know that you're listening. I'm excited about our guest today on the All Me podcast. I met Dr. Margaret Goodman back in 2012 when our paths crossed in this crazy tight-knit world of anti-doping. Welcome to the show, Dr. Goodman.
Thank you so much for having me. It's a real honor. I'm real excited to be here.
I'm looking forward to talking to you too. So you gave me a gift years ago that I'll never forget, and it's a story I still share with a bunch of people today. And I don't know if you remember this or not, but I think it was back in 2013. You invited us to come out to Las Vegas and speak on a panel of experts that you had put together to educate. I believe there were amateur fighters in the room, coaches, parents, and it was a really cool modern building we're in. Do you remember that?
I sure do. It was at the Louisville Center for Brain Health. It was a great place. It was wonderful for you guys to come.
It was a great program. And I remember having, such a really cool panel of speakers that were talking. And after the program, we wrapped up and you came over to me with an envelope and you offered me a ticket to UFC 167. And that was the fight between George St. Pierre and Johnny Hendricks at the MGM Grand. Now, it was the first UFC fight I'd ever been to, so I had no idea what to expect. And as the arena filled up and the fights got further and further in before the title fight, it was so awesome. I can't explain it to people that have never actually been to a UFC fight, but it's a memory I'll never forget.
It is. I mean, it's one reason why I loved boxing and MMA so much, but especially boxing, just because there's just an electricity at an event that you really don't get with any other type of sporting event. Now, I've never been to an NFL game, and I'm sure that's really cool, but it is just wonderful. You feel like you're a part of the action. It's such drama, life-fulfilling drama that's going on in this ring. It's changing lives right before your eyes. So it's a pretty cool thing.
And extremely talented, very well-trained athletes. And it's just a sport. Yes. I tell people, if you love it on TV, you will absolutely be blown away if you got a chance to see it in person.
I agree. I think that from my perspective, after having been around these sports so much, I almost find boxing, professional boxing, a bit more so because the athletes are really facing one another, standing up at all times, hopefully, And there's just, to me, there's even greater drama there from that sport. And I think there's, probably just as much danger, if not more. But yeah, both sports are fantastic to be around. And the athletes are amazing, amazing.
It is pretty incredible. Now, boxing is one sport I have not had a chance to go see live, but it's a bucket list item for sure.
Yeah, I think once people go to a boxing match, a professional boxing match, even if it's a low-level type club show where the fighters are maybe, not the highest level of moneymakers at that point in time, there's a certain quality to it that it makes it hard for you not to fall in love with it. Despite the brutality of it, there's always that element. But the fact that these two athletes, whether they're men or women, are willing to stand up and face each other under these circumstances really begs respect and awe. And I just think it's a wonderful event to go see.
I couldn't agree more. Well, let's talk about you. You have quite an impressive resume, which we're going to get to throughout this podcast. And I want to start by giving the listeners a bit of a background on who you are and your profession. And as a neurologist who has been in practice for more than 20 years, what is the study of neurology and what got you interested in becoming a neurologist?
Neurology basically is kind of what you would think of it as study of the nervous system, the peripheral and central nervous system. The central nervous system refers to the brain and the spinal cord. The peripheral nervous system refers to when people get pinched nerves, cervical or lumbar pinched nerves, things of that nature, or peripheral nerve disease. But the central nervous system can encompass illnesses as simple as migraines, can also encompass things like seizures, multiple sclerosis, stroke, dementia. And when I knew that I wanted to be a physician, neurology was a great consultant field. It was a way to kind of learn all the time as you're doing it. And so it's a non-boring field for a specialist. And the good thing about neurology these days is when I first started so many years ago, it's actually been more than 20, there weren't a lot of things that neurologists could cure. And a lot of people thought it was kind of the end point or the, bag where people couldn't really be helped. But it's changed so much through the years with some new medications and treatment regimens. And so it's become even more fascinating. And as far as getting interested in combat sports, I was finishing my residency through UCLA in Southern California, and I knew that I was going to be moving to Las Vegas. And at that time, there was no MMA, there was boxing. And I had always loved boxing, used to watch with my dad, and I just thought it was just the most fascinating endeavor. And so coming to Las Vegas, it was something that was always on my mind to try to see about getting involved in. So I got involved in that in around 1994 and started in amateurs, working with amateur fighters so I could learn the craft of what entailed being a ring physician. And then soon after that time, I was put on the athletic commission as a ringside physician and did that for a number of years. It was a great, great, cool thing to do. Very impressive learning experience, too.
That's really neat. So you talk about how you went to UCLA, and I know you ended up getting your MD in Chicago. Is that correct?
Correct.
Okay,
that's where I went to medical school.
How do you end up in Chicago from Southern California?
Well, what happens is when you apply for medical school, you have to apply. Back then, believe it or not, I think it's a lot easier to get into medical school these days. But back then, you had to apply to a bunch of schools to see where you could get admitted. And there wasn't, way back in the dark ages, there wasn't as many women in medical school. Yeah. And so there were, I wouldn't say that it was restricted, but there was less numbers of females and it was harder to get in at that time. So I applied to multiple places, and Chicago Medical School was where I ended up, and it was I loved Chicago. I didn't mind the winter so much. The summers were just way too humid for me, but it's a great city to be in. And then I came back home where I was from to Los Angeles to finish my training. And then Las Vegas was a really great opportunity because back when I moved here, in the late 80s, early 90s, there were hardly any neurologists here. So it was a good place to establish a practice.
It's funny you say that you didn't mind the Chicago winters, which are brutally cold, by the way. And,
I know.
It was the humid summers. And Chicago is one of my favorite cities in the United States, but I'm talking Chicago summertime. I have been in Chicago in January and February, and it is freezing. So I do love going there, but it's kind of neat. But hey, you got to experience that cold weather at some point in your life. So why Las? You had talked about you knew you were going to end up in Las Vegas. Why Las Vegas?
Well, at the time, I was married, and my ex-husband, he was an anesthesiologist, or is one, and this was a good place for us to practice because it was more open. There were so many doctors in Southern California, so many of which have moved here through the years, but it was a better way to establish yourself. It became a great opportunity from practicing and also from financial aspect of it too, because there were so many less physicians here. So it was the right move for me at the time, and that boxing was just everywhere here. So it was hard to escape, and it was something that it was kind of like people that are moved to LA. I lived among that as well. My dad was in the music business, so I was exposed to a lot of people in the entertainment area. And so when people move to LA, that's kind of the cause to celeb there. I mean, here it's gaming and sports, and boxing was a big part of it. So it just seemed like the perfect area.
Cool. So let's continue on this discussion of combat sports. And you say, your dad played a role in you being interested in that. And for those listeners who are hearing the term combat sports for the first time, when you and I are here talking about this, can you define combat sports for us? What does that entail?
Well, to me, I was thinking about that when you mentioned that to me, and we were talking about what we were going to discuss today. Really, maybe it should be unarmed combat sports, because in a way, no one is carrying any weapons. Their weapons are their two hands and arms and legs and intelligence. But it involves sports like mixed martial arts, like you would see with the UFC and some other organizations like Bellator. But it also involves boxing. And some wrestling could be considered a combat sport, but predominantly as far as professional athletes go, you would consider just boxing and mixed martial arts as the two entities. And basically, like I said, I mean, when those athletes enter either a cage or a ring, depending on which actual sport they're competing in, they really have nothing but their hands, depending on the kinds of gloves they're wearing, depends on the sport. And the rest is smartness. I think it can be brutal. Some people, I remember way back when, and every once in a while it unfortunately comes up when there's severe injuries that happen, say, how could a neurologist want to be a part of something like that, where the aim is to either knock out your opponent, hurt your opponent. But I think that I learned more working in combat sports as a neurologist than actually I did in so many respects as a neurologist in training, especially involving the brain and cognition and just learning what happens with concussion, because you're there as these things actually happen. And you're there in a role to try to prevent something serious from happening, which is a really interesting thing for a physician.
Yeah, and these athletes need you. I mean, you can care for them. You understand the injury if there is one, but most importantly, you understand how to teach them, or at least try to prevent, like you said, the injury from happening.
And the sad part is that you can't always. One of the most important things that I think that we were able to accomplish, and that has obviously gone further as the years have gone by since I left working as a ringside physician, is just the level of testing before, medical tests. If you look at all the things that go on with the NFL and complaints about, athletes developing chronic traumatic encephalopathy or brain injury as a result of playing football those years, obviously boxing and MMA are two sports where those are distinct possibilities and occurrences that you try to advance the testing so that when an athlete enters the ring or a cage, they're as healthy as possible. And I'm sure as we'll go into performance-enhancing drug testing and being aware of performance-enhancing drugs and all the things that you've gone through with your family, that, all of these are variables that you try to limit as much as you can. In other words, when a fighter begins their career, you want them to begin that career with a healthy nervous system and, obviously healthy orthopedics and otherwise, good general health. But you want them to start off healthy as possible so that when they do, they are involved in these endeavors, the injuries that they incur won't be so serious. And that as time goes on, just like all of us as we age, there it's in a more finite few years, that you want to make sure that their health is maintained to the best of your ability as an administrator overseeing these sports. And that's one of the greatest benefits in athletic commissions and being associated with a great athletic commission like Nevada when I was, because there was a lot that we could do because we had a lot of big fights that were generating tax income. So we could ask for further testing of these athletes. So it was really a very big education for me.
What a really unique perspective to give a listener, an inside look into what combat sports is, and especially from the eyes of a physician like yourself. But you talk about in the early 90s, 94, you got into amateur boxing. What was your introduction into this? I mean, how do you you get out of school and then the next thing you know, you're involved in combat sports? How does that happen?
Well, here was the thing, and it's different in every jurisdiction, not just in North America, but also in other countries. And the way it kind of worked in Nevada, and that's really the only one I can really speak to, is that the specific commission here had a number of physicians, and they were all male at that time. And basically, they don't readily or frequently add physicians to that roster. So I was really interested in doing that. I met my partner in life, who was the biggest, most well-known ring physician, Flip Homansky, who worked all the big fights here. And I met him while I was doing consults in the emergency room because he was an emergency room doctor. And I approached him and said, how do I get involved? And basically he said, well, you better learn something first. You can't just do this. And I was like, well, wait a minute, I'm a neurologist. What's the big deal? And it's a specialty unto itself. There's now a wonderful association called the Association of Ringside Physicians that actually, educates ring physicians from all over the country and even internationally on how to work ringside, because there is no specific residency that you can do. And so you're kind of learning on the fly. So at that time, I was told, well, if you want to be considered to do this, you better go work the amateurs. And obviously, amateur boxing is a great deal different than professional boxing from a multitude of reasons. The number of rounds is different. The length of the rounds is different. And also, the impetus to stop a fight is much greater in amateur boxing as professional boxing. But it was really interesting. I mean, you were working with kids, and you didn't have a lot of time to examine them. And in the amateurs, they don't undergo a lot of pre-fight examinations and actual physical testing. So it was interesting. So I did that for about a year and a half until the commission was interested in adding a ring physician. And then I just applied, and I was really happy to get on. And when I first started, this was around 95, I think, or 96. When I first started, the only fights that they would really let me work, because I was such a newbie, were mostly like professional wrestling. So believe it or not, it was then the WWF and not the WWE. Yeah. But we would have that here. We'd also have other smaller wrestling organizations that would come and work at bring fights to the casinos with these guys. And even though most people would probably hate this, but they're predetermined who's going to win, and these guys know each other, it still can involve great danger. I mean, those athletes are incredible. I don't know if you watched that movie that The Rock did. I forget something Fighting with My Family or something.
Yes, him and Vince Vaughn. Yeah, I saw that.
Yeah, it was a very good film. And what people don't realize is how hard those athletes work and how much in danger they are. And so I loved professional wrestling before I moved to Las Vegas. So I was really happy I got to work all those events. And then slowly, as I started to prove myself, I was given more chances to work ringside. Usually they start ring physicians off in the back. And by that, I mean, when you see, people just think that ring physicians just jump in the ring when someone gets knocked out, but it's much more than that. Much more than that. We would evaluate the athletes' medical testing that they've had before they actually, are accepted into your jurisdiction. So whatever tests they had, they undergo blood tests and scans and general physicals and heart tests and things like that. And then technically you would examine them before the fight, usually around 24 hours before, do a physical exam. And then there's doctors, certain specific doctors, when you're assigned, you work in the back. Especially in a state like Nevada where we have so many fights and big fights, you either work ringside or you work in the back. So when you start off, you work in the back. And that means after the fighters complete their fight, you go in the back and you examine them. And
so every fighter after every fight will get an exam.
Yes.
Okay.
And during that time, you'll document, what injuries they've had, whether it's cuts or hand injuries, orthopedic injuries. You see a lot more in MMA than you would in boxing. And then you also determine if they look like they've had a concussion. And then you make a determination. We have paramedics there, and we make a determination on who goes to the hospital, how long a suspension they receive. Athletes receive different suspensions depending if they've been knocked out or they're just stopped in a fight with it. We call it technical knockout, where they don't lose consciousness. So there's all that kind of level. Cuts, how long it's going to take for a cut to heal. So there's all these different variables, and that's what you do in the back. And so that teaches you a great deal. And the one interesting thing that we're going to talk about is back when I was doing that, and I loved doing that because you were with the fighters afterwards, and whether they won or lost and who was with them, it was just a fascinating story that would unfold, even more so than what you would see in the actual fight, where they came from, what they were experiencing, the highs, the lows, etc. But we would also, at that time, we would be in charge of collecting the urine for drug testing. And so, I learned a lot about that at that time and how limited it was.
I love listening to you talk because I can just feel your passion coming through the phone about, how passionate you are about caring for these athletes. So for the listeners, what would be a typical day at the office for you during a fight night or a match, whether you're working ringside during a match or even like after you were describing taking care of a fighter post-fight?
So obviously that's some time ago, but because I don't see fighters in my office, and neither did I ever see fighters in my office as a ring physician. We really were not allowed to. It's different in different jurisdictions. But the reason why you weren't allowed to, and this is one thing that Dr. Homansky and I were very strong in making sure was a regulation, is if you're going to be sitting there watching someone fight or compete in the ring, and only one of those individuals is your patient that you've seen in your office for various reasons, whether they had a concussion or they had a cut, you have a conflict of interest. So technically, as a ring physician, you're not allowed, except under emergency circumstances, to care for that athlete under private circumstances as an actual physician. So for me, when I used to work fights, the most important thing for me was to learn as much as I could about that individual, just like when you go to the doctor and they want to see your prior medical records. If you've had any tests done, if you had any prior exams, what kind of illnesses have you had in the past, what medications you're on. So I would do as much as I could to learn about that individual, what kind of fights they had, what happened to them in those fights, how long time off they had, why they had that time off. So you would learn about their history, and that would kind of give you information on what you would expect depending on who their opponent was that specific night. So I would spend time doing that. I also had the privilege of, as time went on, of being appointed by the Nevada governor to be head of their medical advisory board, which meant that for several years, I would review the actual medical tests that a fighter had had coming into the state of Nevada to help the commission make a determination on whether an athlete should be licensed or not. Because obviously you can imagine, just like it is in other sports like football, that if somebody's had too many concussions, too many knockouts, too many other injuries, or looks like that they're at risk of developing chronic brain injury, that individual should not be licensed to compete. And that was probably the hardest aspect of the job, because no one wants to take away anyone's way to earn a living. But unfortunately, license to compete either in MMA or boxing is not a right. It's a privilege. And someone has to determine their ability to do that job. And so that often depends on their history as an athlete. And then the commission makes further determinations on matchups and who's equally matched so that there's no unfair advantage. And so I would end up doing that before the event. And then at the event, you get there probably about 45 minutes to an hour early to make sure all the fighters are there and that they're feeling good. I mean, there have been instances, not just here in Nevada, but in other places, where a fighter has suffered an injury in training and they come to the arena to fight that night, and you find out that they shouldn't be fighting because they're already injured. So you kind of evaluate them briefly in that respect. And then depending on whether or not you were working ringside, if you were working ringside, as I did for a lot of times, you would discuss the athletes with the referees, because the referees are the one in the ring, and in the state of Nevada, the referee is the only one that can actually stop a fight. So you would work on your communication with that referee in regards to that specific fighter that they were going, or fighters that they were going to be overseeing. You know, in other words, if somebody looked like they had had some rough fights before and you were a little bit more worried about them, you would discuss that. You would also discuss maybe who the opponent was. If it looks like, you know, they could be in trouble with that specific opponent, you would be aware of that. You would have communication with the referee between rounds if you need to check the fighter between rounds to make sure that they're okay, not just if they've had a cut or not, but if you think that they should continue. And then one great thing that was instituted here, which I was very wholeheartedly in favor of, is after every fight, the ring doctor that's working ringside also checks the fighter very briefly in the ring before the fighter leaves the ring to go in the back. And then if you were working in the back, you would check the fighter in the back, and like I said earlier, determine triaging them. You'd always have paramedics with you, because if somebody needs to be transported, they usually need to be transported immediately. So it was a very interesting thing. It really takes up all of that specific day and maybe even a day before to study what's going on. And obviously you examine them at the weigh-in, and that would take probably several hours, not just with each individual fighter. Those exams tend to be very quick, but you would examine them before about 24 hours before the fight.
So, and I'm just thinking to other sports that we've been around and having the opportunity to work with athletic trainers and other types of physicians. It sounds like you've got to do a lot of paperwork and a lot of documentation every time you have contact with one of these fighters. Is that sort of the same thing in your sport? Is you're seeing them before the fight, you get to go visit with them, make sure they're okay? I mean, are you having to document all that? Okay. That's what I thought.
Yes, you are. And as the years have gone by and time has gone by since I've left, I've just been a huge proponent of that kind of documentation, because that's one of the major problems with combat sports is and I don't know how to put this without, I don't mean it in any kind of a negative way, but the level of oversight is not the same in every specific commission jurisdiction. So the way MMA and boxing is regulated in the U.S., for example, and in North America, it's regulated specifically by each commission. So New York has a commission, California has a commission, Nevada has a commission, Arkansas has a commission, Tennessee has a commission, etc. And not every commission, because of the level of events that they have the benefit of having enough personnel to make all of these various determinations that we've discussed. It can take, there's people that are on the commission that are happy to do it, but there's sometimes not enough tax revenues generated to have that kind of strict oversight. So the regulations can vary from state to state. And for a number of years, I worked with the Association of Boxing Commissions, which also oversees MMA, to create standardization in those regulations. In other words, this sounds ridiculous that this wouldn't be the case, but should every jurisdiction have every fighter undergo HIV and hepatitis testing at least once a year, if not more? Well, you'd go, well, how could that even be a question? But because there's not enough financial aspect to it to generate that. Some of those things weren't always done. And, we're dealing with a blood sport. So
Yeah.
who would not think that that was important? As far as, it even carries forward to like drug testing. It definitely carried forward to like brain testing. And that's why one of the things that I was really happy to help accomplish in the state of Nevada was that every fighter that would come here would have to have had an MRI of their brain and MR angiography to look at the circulation of their brain to make sure they didn't have an aneurysm or vascular malformation that could lead to a devastating injury. So we would require that. And then we would also require additional testing depending on a number of rounds that athlete had already had, what kind of injuries they've had, what we would expect. So the good and the bad is that depending on what jurisdiction you go to and the level of experience of those people overseeing the combat sports in that jurisdiction, they will give a fighter maybe a suspension. They may not give a fighter a suspension, and that you might think is different. And obviously you can't watch every single fight that goes on in every single place in the United States and even in the world. So it's sometimes hard to know enough about the fighter. So what you were talking about as far as documentation is even more important. But even today, I would say from standing and looking on the outside, the documentation is not nearly where it should be. So that we don't know often enough about an athlete coming to a specific event, what's happened to them and what hasn't. And sometimes there's commissions that don't share enough information just because of their strict regulations on protection of medical information. So you don't always have enough information.
Yeah.
So it can become an unknown. And that's where severe injuries can sometimes happen.
Okay. How many professional matches have you been a part of?
I would say back when I was working, there was at least 500 different cards that I worked, and most of those cards probably had at least somewhere between 6 and 10 or 12 fights on them, individual fights, matches.
Okay.
So a lot. I examined a lot of boxers, and like I said, it was, and a lot of MMA athletes too. When MMA was first licensed in the state of Nevada with the UFC, I was very happy to work a lot of those events. But it's something that you learn as time goes on. I mean, obviously, I was at ringside when we had severe injuries too, and that's just devastating. I mean, I don't think anything is more heartfelt than seeing something terrible happen that you weren't able to prevent, or that you didn't really have a role in, but happens before your eyes. It's life changing.
I guess you could also use the word scary.
Yeah, I don't negate that, but it is important to understand the seriousness of what your role is at all times. And I think that most ring physicians do.
Yeah.
I just think that the hard part is that a lot of them in different jurisdictions don't have the experience. They don't have the benefits of being in states like California that has so many fights a year, and New York and Nevada and all these places that have so many competitions. It's just like anything that you do. It's just like a surgeon. You don't want the surgeon to operate on you. This is the very first operation they've ever done like this. It's just like flying a plane. You want someone to have had that experience. And it's the same thing with ringside medicine.
Okay. You've seen a lot of fights. What would you say is the most memorable match and why?
Oh, God. Well, there's two ways of looking at that. There's bad memorable and there's good memorable.
Let's say good memorable. Like what's
let's do that.
One you'll never forget, because everybody knows. If you can't unsee a really bad incident, but something that you'll never forget the rest of your life, because like, wow, I'm really glad to be a part of this. It was just a great match.
Oh, I mean, there were so many. It would be hard. I mean, I was present at some of the Tyson fights. I was present at a lot of the Oscar De La Hoya fights. All of those were incredible events to be a part of. I would just sit there when the fighters were coming into the arena, and you'd just be in awe and you'd be in awe when you'd examine them at the weigh-in of how physically fit they have to be. And, no one is ever perfect that enters the ring. I mean, every fighter has some kind of injury, especially at the level of training that these guys do. But it was just it's like a beautiful ballet. I would say it was either a ballet or an opera that would unfold before your eyes and have several acts to it. And so that's why I really recommend that if a lot of your listeners haven't ever really gotten into watching boxing, that and in MMA, that they start doing it, so just to kind of follow the drama of it all. It's funny, all these movies that they make about boxing. I know they're starting to do more about MMA these days, but the stories of these guys and women, they're just incredible stories of what they've come through and where they've gotten to be in this role. And that's why the other thing that's so important, I'm sorry for not specifically naming something. I mean, I've been in a lot of fights, but I think that it's so important to understand the implications of what's happening, not just from a medical standpoint, but how careers and livelihoods change so drastically with one loss or one win. So, you have a role in that as well, and that's why it's so very important to be vigilant, extremely vigilant when you're there, not just from a medical standpoint.
So you've had the opportunity to work with some of the world's greatest fighters then.
Oh, yeah. I mean, I was very lucky.
That's so
very
cool.
lucky. I mean, yeah, no, it's very cool, and I cherished every moment of it. But there was a time when I just felt it wasn't the right thing for me, and it wasn't safe enough for me, and that's why I walked away. And I stayed away from the sport for a few years, and then I started. I think we've talked about this, that I started getting interested in how horse racing was regulated very similar to boxing, and that how performance-enhancing drug testing was actually much better in horse racing than it was in combat sports. And so that's how I kind of came back to it in a different way.
I just love how passionate you are about this. It's so inspiring, and that leads to our next topic about some of the awards that you've received and some of the honors that you've received just due to the great work that you've done, the expertise that you had. In 2004, 2005, you were the Nevada State Athletic Commission's ringside physician. What was it like being in that role, and what responsibilities did you have?
Well, I think, and I don't want to be redundant for you, but it was pretty much what we've discussed.
Okay.
So that was kind of what my role was. I did, it's funny, when I used to lecture and give talks, Dr. Homansky and I did, to the Association of Boxing Commissions, where they would have a yearly meeting where all the different commissions would come. They'd send their directors and some of their personnel. And the one thing that I think was the hardest role, which is probably the most important role, I think, and is still probably one of the most difficult roles for anybody affiliated with an athletic commission overseeing boxing and MMA, is when should an athlete no longer compete. And so, that's not the funnest thing to do, because as I talked about, who wants to take away somebody's livelihood? Yep. But it is probably the most difficult aspect of it, but was one of the things that I thought was the most important aspect. And obviously it was a great honor to work ringside, but there was never so much pressure, so much, I don't know what the right word would be. It was just so involving to determine if a fighter shouldn't compete anymore. And it's a very hard determination, because there's no exact medical test that will tell you when that point in time is. So that's why it's so wonderful, a lot of research that's now ongoing that wasn't ongoing when I was with the Athletic Commission here, onto how fighters evolve through the years, and when is a point where how many punches can someone take? How many fights should someone have? How can you catch that before they become beyond the point of no return? And so to me, that was probably the hardest thing to do, but was probably one of the most important roles that I feel that I had.
So I read in your bio that in 2005, you received the Boxing Writers Association of America's James A. Farley Award in recognition of a career marked by honesty and integrity, and you've been recognized by the Association of Professional Ring Physicians as Educator of the Year. What do these awards mean to you?
It sounds terrible. It's I feel like, what's that old Woody Allen thing, is the award really important if you're the one that receives it? It can't be that big of a deal. But no, I think they were really amazing awards, and I was so happy to be a part of the organization, especially the Boxing Writers, because they sit and watch everything and criticize everything. That's the other thing that we didn't really talk about, is that constantly you're being criticized, just like referees in football and baseball, the umpires. I mean, everybody's being criticized constantly, and as a ring physician, you are as well. But, I just think that I was so fortunate to receive the award, especially from the boxing writers. I think I got another one a couple of years ago for a different thing. But it's just because they were there. They understand really what's going on, the ins and outs. And, it was I remember when I said I wanted to be a ring physician, and Dr. Homansky had been doing it for so long, he said to me, "Are you going to be able to take the pressure?" And I was like, "What? You're a doctor. What's the big deal?" But you're under such great scrutiny from all sides.
Yeah.
And not just from the fans and the media. And back then there wasn't as much, internet people that were all over yourself. But it was still a great deal of scrutiny. And like I said, you had these athletes' lives in your hands in a lot of respects. And so you always wanted to do the right thing. So yeah, no, I think it was great that it was just cool being honored by those organizations. And I think education is the hardest part. And just like we talked about earlier, there is no residency for being a ring physician. I wish there were, but there isn't. And so you learn from other doctors, you learn from employing your specialty. It doesn't just have to be a neurologist. There's all kinds of ring physicians in different specialties. Obviously in some respects, emergency medicine is probably the ideal, but there's orthopedic surgeons and ophthalmologists and general surgeons and all kinds of different doctors that participate in this.
In 2012, you were named HBO's The Fight Games Person of the Year. This is another prestigious award. Can you tell us more about this award?
When right now HBO doesn't have professional boxing anymore, and they did for so many years, and I was so happy to work a lot of the fights that were on HBO. But basically, a familiar name to a lot of individuals by the name of Jim Lampley, who I think is probably one of the best sports commentators of all, including in boxing. He just understood the difficulty in implementing performance-enhancing drug testing in boxing. And he knew from being around the sport for so many years, and he was so brilliant and remains to be brilliant, that it was just unfortunate that was something that was being overlooked. And so he was so happy to see the origination and implementation of VADA, the Voluntary Anti-Doping Association, in professional sports of boxing and MMA, especially boxing, because that was where he worked most of the time, as far as, those were the fights on HBO. And so he was kind enough to give that to me and to VADA for the work that we had been doing.
Okay. And that I do want to talk about performance enhancing drugs, because ultimately, Margaret, that's how our paths in life crossed. And I know how passionate you are about that. And being passionate about anti-doping in sports and efforts, you formed a 501c3 nonprofit that you've mentioned, the Voluntary Anti-Doping Association, which we're going to refer to as VADA. Why is it important to you to protect athletes from using performance-enhancing drugs, or to also protect those who have decided to compete clean but might be competing against somebody who's using performance-enhancing drugs?
Well, you just hit the nail on the head, so to speak, as far as why it's so important. And, that's exactly how you and I met, and your dad as well. And it just, I knew from examining many fighters and talking to fighters that the education, number one, the education wasn't there on what was dangerous to them to enter into the ring or cage on, but also what do you really want in combat sports? Two individuals facing one another, and often can, result in serious injury, either acute or chronic injury. You want them to have a fair event where each fighter has an equal chance of success. Okay.
Yeah.
So, obviously you want them physically fit, and that's why we do these exams and have them undergo these tests. But would you, like you said, how horrible is it to have one fighter face another who has an unfair advantage of being on a performance-enhancing drug regimen? And do these athletes understand the risks of using those substances? And, you can talk about that more than anyone. So to me, that was something that was being terribly overlooked because of what we talked about earlier as far as the lack of funding. Unlike organizations like Major League Baseball and the NFL, there's no players association where there's money generated. There's not the NFL kind of oversight where they donate huge amounts of money for fighters to undergo their testing. Yeah. Often fighters have to pay for their own testing, whether it be an MRI or an HIV or a CBC or whatever it is. And so when you look at the expense and the fact that most fighters don't make the kind of money that you see on television like a Floyd Mayweather, who's going to pay for that? Nobody wants to pay for it. The promoters don't want to pay for it. The managers can't afford it. There's little or no money set aside from ticket prices. So to me, what was happening is drug testing and educating athletes in performance-enhancing drugs was way down on the totem pole. Was getting no attention. And what would happen is, at least in the state of Nevada at the time when I was there, we would do drug testing back then only post-fight for urine only on the championship events. So there were all these other fighters that were never getting drug tested. And all of those other guys were just as susceptible to using these substances as the big money makers. So it was just an unfortunate thing. And there just wasn't that organization to oversee that. Obviously, in Olympic sports, it's a lot different, and money is funded in and given to organizations like USADA through the U.S. government, et cetera, but there was nobody like that to help these fighters. So it was kind of uncharted territory. And to me, I just felt that was something that was being overlooked because, number one, like I mentioned, when I started to see what was going on in horse racing, there was a lot more drug testing in horse racing than there was in MMA and boxing. And so somebody had to bring it to the forefront. And so the reason why I created VADA in this long tirade that I'm going into is because it needed to be brought up as a problem. Because as you and I well know, and you look historically at all kinds of situations in competition, of any kind of competition, you don't even have to look, track and field, cycling, et cetera, weightlifting, everything. There was performance-enhancing drugs are rampant. They're rampant in the schools. And so to me, it was a way we could start to educate not just the fighters, their coaches, their trainers, their managers, but also the public that this is something that needs to be addressed. And so that's why we created VADA.
And it's such a wonderful organization. And I feel we're at a different point in time now where there are always going to be those athletes that want to cheat the system, that want to try to take a shortcut and gain that extra edge. But there's also a lot of athletes out there who want more testing, one, for their safety, but two, to keep the integrity of the sport. It's one athlete versus one athlete, not one athlete that's taking this mixed drug versus this other athlete who has even a better designer drug, right? So in the world of professional combat sports, how prevalent do you think the use of performance-enhancing drugs still is?
Oh, I think it's huge. Do I think it's all intentional? Maybe not, because I can tell you from my perspective, and it's probably true in many other sports, it's amazing the number of supplements that boxers and MMA athletes take. I mean, I can be as long as the list is as long as your arm, as they would say. And so it's a real problem because, number one, these combat athletes don't know what's legal, and also they don't know how harmful a lot of these substances are from not just physical but also emotional standpoint. And what are the sequelae or the results of using these things over time to their life once they get out of these sports, and whether or not these substances can predispose them to acute and chronic brain injury, or liver disease or cancer and all these other things that we know about performance-enhancing drugs. So it was so frustrating to me that there wasn't a avenue to begin doing that. And it was funny because I remember when we started VADA, people say, oh, no fighter is going to want to sign up for VADA because, number one, not just the cost, because, it costs there's an additional cost that would not otherwise have to be incurred. to undergo, really good drug testing, not just at an event, but, random unannounced testing throughout the year or leading up to an event. So there was that aspect to it, but there was also the aspect to it that why would someone want to risk that, not knowing, having the knowledge of what could be prohibited or what could turn up to make them prohibited. And as you see these days, especially in the media, especially much more in MMA than in boxing these days, and in organizations like the UFC that does a lot of drug testing now, and I'm, so glad that they do, that there's so many athletes that end up caught on these things or popped from using prohibited substances that they didn't know were in a supplement, or they were hoping they could sneak by using. No one's accusatory of anybody specifically, in each case is different, but anyway, there was just that huge lack of information, and now things are a lot better in the sense that athletes, especially fighters that never used to even know why they shouldn't take aspirin before a fight, even though it's not prohibited, the dangers of lowering your bleeding time so that you could get cut more easily and hard to stop bleeding in a fight, etc. But now a lot of fighters are all over the internet and Twitter, and so they learn about a lot of this stuff so they can make more informed decisions on their own.
Yeah, and testing today is so much more sophisticated than it was even 5-10 years ago. And one of the things you said is you don't believe that all appearance and performance enhancing substance use is intentional. Can you elaborate on that?
Well, I don't, look, I don't have statistics, nor could I even come up with statistics. And you asked me about how prevalent these things are. And I would tend to think that they're fairly prevalent. I would say, that it's just hard to know how rampant these things are, because the problem is, athletes get told, hey, try this out. This will help you. This will give you more energy. This will make you look better. This will help you have more power. It'll help you recover. I mean, a lot of these things are used for recovery, and that's hence the importance of testing leading up to an event or throughout the year. But, I think it's just that aspect that most athletes don't know, and they're often given things by other people or told something is okay, and or they're told it's prohibited, but you won't get caught on it. And then a lot of athletes just go to the health food store and pick up things that have prohibited substances in them that aren't even labeled, or they get things from different countries that weren't processed the right way that carry prohibited substances even though they're not legal, or listed on there. So there's all those different aspects. I wish that no fighter took anything.
You're right.
Right. That would be the safest way to go, but I understand that's never going to happen. But I think that, the education aspect of like what you guys do is so very important. And when you came and talked to those amateur kids, and a lot of those fighters there were professional MMA fighters, because I think you remember there was a UFC fight the next night. So I think, having those individuals learn more is just such a great asset from your organization. That's kind of what motivated me as well.
And we're gonna do a whole podcast on dietary supplements. In fact, one of the podcasts we're gonna do is with one of our partners, NSF Certified for Sport, because I think what most people don't realize is just because you can purchase it at a health food store, I can order it online, it's not necessarily safe. And that also doesn't mean that everything on the label is not actually in there, because we know dietary supplements are very loosely regulated. And I've talked to guys that have fought in the UFC or that are MMA fighters that were taking a product for many, many years. And the company that they were purchasing their products from reformulated whatever it was in that product. And the next thing you know, they've tested positive and can't figure out what happened. And that's one of the reasons we partnered with NSF Certified for Sport, because they test for over 270 banned substances within their products. And, they're also a partner of Major League Baseball. Let's go to the testing here for a second and what you do at VADA. Take us through what an athlete might go through when they go through your program.
So right now, we have different categories in the sense that we've been privileged to work with the World Boxing Council, one of the major sanctioning organizations that sanctions championship fights. And with sanctioning bodies, and this is kind of beyond the scope of what you're asking, but with sanctioning bodies, fighters are rated. They may be rated 1 to 15, and then there's other ones that may be rated as well. So one thing that the World Boxing Council did a few years back, that we've been able to administrate their program with Mauricio Suleiman, who's just a huge advocate for clean sport. And people thought that this would never happen because boxing, as we've talked about, is an international sport. There's fighters that fight all over the world on a daily basis, in all different countries and different languages, and it's amazing how huge a sport it is. But there's no one unifying body. So one thing that they did, they required all of the fighters in the top 15 and any fighter that wanted to volunteer that wasn't in the top 15 to enroll in their clean boxing program. And as a result of that, these fighters, and now there's probably over 600 fighters worldwide enrolled in that program that are eligible for testing throughout the year. So they submit paperwork to us, and they're eligible for us to undergo unannounced random testing for the most stringent anti-doping panels that there are anytime throughout the year. It's not the kind, then we have additional fighters that will sign up if they have an upcoming fight. Usually it's that the individual and their opponent, maybe 6 to 8 weeks, sometimes 12 to 14 weeks before an event. For example, we recently did the Andy Ruiz-Anthony Joshua heavyweight fight in Saudi Arabia, and those fighters entered our program almost 3 months before the event, and were tested with unannounced random testing through that event and at the actual event. So those fighters send us paperwork. We have an app that they can use, or they continue to let us know their whereabouts at all times, and they're subject to blood and urine testing. And so basically that's funded either by the promotional entity, the athletic commission, or the fighters themselves, believe it or not. And they undergo a testing program. And those results that they undergo, we work with, we think, the finest doping collection company in the world called Claridium, and they have doping collection officers, just like you would in the Olympics, travel to these individuals' locations, where it be any country, tested all over the world. I think I was trying to think this the other day. The only place we haven't really tested specifically is in India yet. But at any rate, they go to that individual and collect the specimens, and then we send the blood and or the urine to a World Anti-Doping Agency accredited lab for review, and those results go to us. But we also share those results with the Association of Boxing Commissions that oversees combat sports, as well as a specific athletic commission where that fighter holds a license. And it goes to the fighter, and it goes, especially if it's dealing with sanctioning bodies, like in the World Boxing Council program, it goes to them. It may go, if there's 2 fighters that are enrolled leading up to a fight, it goes to their opponents' promotional representatives as well, so that the results are always known. We don't list results on the internet or do that. That's not our role, but to make sure that all the oversight administrative bodies are aware of the results, as well as the athletes themselves.
Yeah, it's quite complex.
It is. It is.
When you talk about drawing blood versus urine, is there any way for you to summarize what am I looking at in the blood and what am I looking at in the urine, and is one better than the other?
It's funny because it's a question that comes up a lot, but truth be told, and also, by the way, I think soon, just like some other organizations, we're going to be able to do blood spot testing where it can be like on a finger stick and we won't have to actually draw blood, use a phlebotomist. But what we check for is in the urine, there are several hundred things, just like you talked about NSF, that can check for prohibited substances. There are several hundred things that are checked for in a urine test. And even things that you would think that you would check for in a blood test are sometimes checked for in a urine test, like checking for blood doping can be done by checking for substances that are used to increase someone's blood count. That can be done in a urine test, or should be done in a urine test. In blood tests, you can check for blood counts to see if blood doping is going on in that way, and you can also check for substances like human growth hormone. So there's a limited number of things that you're checking for in the blood, but it's just as important in a lot of respects. And a lot of the times when you're checking, the half-life of these substances varies, so it's often hard to catch somebody that may be, has made the decision to to use performance-enhancing drugs, it's sometimes difficult to make a determination and catch them using it because of the half-life of the substance. Hence, that's the importance of unannounced random testing.
For those amateur athletes that are listening who have dreams, like many of us do, to go on and compete in professional sports, with all of your experience as a physician and also all of your experience and expertise in the doping world, if you had one piece of advice that you could give these amateur athletes, what would it be?
I think my main piece of advice would be to learn yourself. Just like it's important for an athlete, especially in these specific sports that have so much inherent danger to them, is to not be afraid to learn on your own. You know, so often because boxers and MMA athletes, but especially boxers, start at a young age in the amateur. They may be a young teenager, and they have a coach, and that coach becomes their parent figure, so to speak, in guiding them in their career, that they learn not to ask questions and learn for themselves not just about performance-enhancing drugs, but when should they not compete? When is a symptom that they're having that's important medically? It's the same thing when it comes to performance-enhancing drugs. Take responsibility and learn for yourself. All that information is available on the internet, on your iPhone, your Samsung, through our organization, to learn yourself, because nobody is going to care for you like you. So to me, that's probably the most important thing, I think, for a young amateur fighter, to be responsible for themselves, and that this is not too complicated for you to learn on your own. And there's plenty of people that will help you with that, organizations like mine, that will help guide you. I mean, I can't tell you how many emails we get from athletes just starting out in boxing and MMA that have questions that we're available for all the time. And to me, that's super important. And if there was anything I would tell an athlete is especially before taking something, is to ask questions about it so that you know if it's good for you and safe for you. I mean, everyone wants an advantage and a leg up, but check things out before you do them.
I couldn't agree more. You only have one body. Take care of it and ask as many questions as you can possibly ask. And what we'll also do, Margaret, is all of your information, website, we will definitely place in the show notes. So for those that are listening in their car, they might be out on a run somewhere, they can go back and reference some of these resources that you're providing. Lastly, I just wanted to make sure you talked about your social media accounts that you have, because we follow you on Twitter and you're always putting really good content out there. So if you can share any of your social media accounts that you have for your organizations, that would be a great resource for our listeners.
Well, obviously, we have a website that has all the information on VADA itself, and that's just, as VADA-testing.org. And so, you can go on or just put in VADA, Voluntary Anti-Doping Association, and you'll find us. We obviously have a Twitter account at VADA_testing. And then we're on Facebook as well in the same respect. We do a lot on Twitter as far as trying to put out information. We always retweet what you guys do, because you always have so many great articles that you have from not just within your organization but outside on things that fighters need to pay attention for. And I mean, I think that it's important for these fighters not to be scared to ask these questions, And we often deal with things in a confidential nature. We even work with an organization called Athletes Recovery that has rehabilitation for those that have been addicted to performance-enhancing drugs and also other illicit drugs that can seek help. That's just guided for athletes. Started by a football and former NFL guy by the name of Kenny Green, who, after he left the NFL, realized that was so very important to have rehabs for substance abuse specifically for athletes. And I just think that, you just need to ask questions, but we're happy to help in any way.
Yeah, Kenny is a great guy, and we'll be sure to put a link to Athletes Recovery in the show notes
Yeah.
as well. But Margaret, this has been a wonderful discussion. We can't thank you for all of your knowledge and stories that you've shared with us today. But before we wrap up and let you go, I'd like to throw a couple of our curveball questions at you. So I'm going to ask you 3 questions, right? And I'll ask them to you one at a time, and just answer the question with the first thing that comes to mind. You ready?
Okay.
All right. So being in the world of sports, right, most people will obtain a nickname. You have been in sports much of your career. Do you have a nickname that you've earned over these years?
No.
Okay.
I would say that as a ring physician, I didn't have a nickname, but well, you know, boy, that's an interesting one. I once had a promoter call me the angel of fight death. In other words, because we were implementing drug testing, and, you know, obviously, just like you would expect, if an athlete turns up positive before an event, their fight would be canceled. So, yeah, so
the angel of fight death.
I know.
Interesting.
That probably isn't a good thing, but yeah, I hate to get that around too much. But
hey, yeah, it's a nickname. So here's a good one. If Hollywood made a movie about your life, which I think would be a great movie, so if we got any Hollywood producers here that are listening, definitely contact Dr. Goodman. Who would play the lead role of Dr. Margaret Goodman?
Jessica Chastain.
Okay. Any reason why?
And you think, yeah, because she has red hair. I really like her as an actress. She's very serious. She's smart. And it's funny because, you know, I did write a novel called Death in Vegas. And it was with a character very much, obviously, about myself. But I remember when you're writing a novel, if you're ever writing a novel, people always tell you to kind of imagine who would play the characters in your novel, and if it was ever made into a film. And I always thought of her as the lead character. So there you go.
And if you don't mind, and we'll have this recorded permission, would you mind if I took a picture of you and a picture of her and, you know, kind of stitched them together into one picture?
No, I sure don't look anything like her. I wish I did, but yeah, that would be funny. I think that you know, I think not my story, but what a lot of the things that we've talked about, and that was the reason why I wrote this novel. It was pretty much thinly veiled, you know, fiction, so to speak. So I didn't end up at the bottom of Lake Mead, but Death in Vegas was kind of a way to talk about the inner workings of the sport, the behind the scenes, other than exactly what happens in a ring and as in a fighter's life. So more about the ins and outs of the sport. So I highly recommend people, if they want to learn more about the sport, that they pick that up. You can get it, you know, through Amazon or one of those things or anywhere online. But I think that it's a fascinating story, and I wish that someone, you know, all these wonderful films that they've made about boxing, you know, they're always centered around a fighter, and I get that, you know, those are great personal stories, but I think the inner workings and a lot of things that we could not touch on this kind of a level in this in this kind of way is fascinating to people, especially if they don't know the sport. And one of the reasons why I did that book was so that it would incite more people to come back to the sport or come to the sport for the very first time and learn about how fascinating and wonderful it is.
Yeah, you have certainly given us a perspective that most people never see, because all we see is the dance. We see the final production, if you will, and you're a part of before that dance happens, you're a part of during that dance happens, and you're a part of it even after it's over. So it's just been wonderful. Now, last question for you. If you could have any superpower in the world, what would it be and why?
Superpower. I would I think if I had a superpower, I would be able to appoint someone, not myself, someone as a combat sport czar in the United States, someone to oversee the sport and make sure that there was equality and that things were similar from jurisdiction to jurisdiction and that there was sufficient protection for the athletes. That's what I would do if I had a superpower.
I love that. Margaret,
Will I ever see it in my lifetime? No, not for the U.S. government, unfortunately, because there's too many people that don't want that kind of thing. But that's really what's needed to protect the fighters.
But you got to plant the seed and, spread them as far and wide as you can, and hopefully they get watered and something grows.
Yeah, I keep hoping.
Well, thank Margaret. It's been great to catch up with you. I always enjoy talking with you, and have known you for so many years. We can't thank you enough for the knowledge that you've shared. I know people will be really interested to listen to this episode. Is there anything else you'd like to add before we close out?
No, I just think that what you've been doing is it's been instrumental in what we've been trying to accomplish in VADA. And so I've learned so much from both you and your dad and your organization that I just feel so complimented by being able to be a part of it. I mean, I'm being really honest. I'm not trying to float your boat, so to speak. I'm just saying that it's been so cool and educational to me that it's made me want to do more. So I thank you.
Well, thank you, because we definitely couldn't do the work that we do on a daily basis without people like you supporting us and providing us the knowledge and expertise that you have. But we appreciate you being on the All Me podcast, Margaret. Thank you so much.
All right. Thank you.
Well, that's it for today's show. Thanks for listening to the All Me podcast from the Taylor Hooten Foundation, a nonprofit organization leading a national campaign to enlighten people to the truths about appearance and performance-enhancing substances and inspiring people to live and compete without the use of these substances. Please be sure to subscribe to our podcast and tune in to our next episode.